Just give me a cue and I'll hit play. Well, good morning to everyone. Good morning from the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire. On the road today. Our home is in Manchester, New Hampshire at Manchester-Boston Regional Airport. But today, as you'll see soon, we are on the runway of London City Airport. There it is. I think we're going to be showing that to you in just a moment. And we're going to be flying today. We're going to be doing some flying. We're going to go from this airport in London, England. There we are. And we're going to be flying around the southeastern part of England. And then we are going to head south and cross the English Channel and look at a little bit of history. We're going to cross a low pass over the beaches of Normandy. And so we're going to be, we're taking off right now, actually. We don't have time to lose. It's a beautiful afternoon here. It's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon local time at London City Airport. My name is Jeff Rapsis, and I'll be your host for the flight. Sort of the Walter Cronkite, I guess, of this whole expedition. And this is a new experiment for us, really. We've never done anything like this before. It's part of a larger program that we've been doing in this era of remote learning, and we'll talk more about that as time goes by. The aircraft we're flying is a C-47 Dakota Transport. This is a vintage aircraft from World War II, from that era, and it actually took part in the D-Day invasions back on June 6th, 1944, so almost 76 years ago. And we'll be seeing different views from outside the plane, too. We apparently have a really ace chase plane crew that's ready to go with views that'll show where we're flying and where we are and some of the landmarks we'll be flying over. But I'm not by myself on this adventure this afternoon in England. On board with us today are a couple other folks who are going to lend us their perspectives and their expertise. I'm here with a bunch of pilots, so let me introduce you to them. I want to first introduce a gentleman named Bob Huff, and Bob Huff is the past president of our board of directors and a pilot. So Bob, welcome aboard.
Thank you. Welcome aboard to everybody who's with us today. It's going to be a fun trip.
Also with us is gentleman named Chuck Guerin, and Chuck was a U.S. Navy captain, and he spent some time in this part of England when he was in the service and as a student. Chuck, good morning.
Good morning, and what a great day to fly.
It is, isn't it? We don't always get that on the simulator that we're using, so we're lucky today. And I also want to come on over to our flight engineer, Jay Carter, is manning the controls, not just of the flight engineer controls of the plane, but also what we're seeing and hearing as we make our way across the channel. So, Jay, hello.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. Glad to be here.
Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to accomplish today. We're going to be flying for about 2 hours, and the highlight of this, of course, will be near the end when we get across the English Channel and we reach the beaches at Normandy, and that's why we're making this flight today. Today is Memorial Day. It's May 25th. And in most years, there's parades today. There's ceremonies, and rightly so, because this is the day when we specifically honor the people who in the past have paid the ultimate price and made the ultimate sacrifice for the freedoms that we enjoy. And that is not happening this year for reasons that we all know about. So many ceremonies and commemorations that would have taken place aren't taking place because we have to be careful about getting together until we get a handle on the coronavirus pandemic that we're all undergoing here and all around the world. And we thought, well, there's one thing we can do with our learning program that we've developed. We're using our simulator to fly around the world. We left Manchester, New Hampshire, our hometown, on May 1st. And we took what's called the historic North Atlantic ferry route across the Atlantic in our vintage C-47, just as aircraft from Manchester, when it was the Grenier Airfield back then, was a major staging point for personnel and equipment to be brought over the North Atlantic by air via a route where you hopscotch across different points of land in order to get over to Europe. So we flew from Manchester to Gander, Newfoundland, to Goose Bay, Labrador, and then across to Greenland. We went to Reykjavik, Iceland, and then came down into Scotland. And we found ourselves here in England, and Memorial Day was coming up. And we felt if we could time it right, we'd be able to fly from London, make our landing on the continent of Europe on our way around the world on Memorial Day. And what better way to do that than to fly over some of the beaches in Normandy that were the scene of the epic D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. And it was last year, the 75th anniversary of that took place, and there was a lot of ceremony. And there's so few people left that were from that time. I think it's really important for us to do what we're doing in any way possible. So the fact that we can't have the usual commemorations and ceremonies this year was what prompted us to sort of re-engineer our around-the-world flight adventure, which we hope students and teachers are using as a remote learning resource while we're doing it, into something that would allow people to commemorate Memorial Day in an age where we have to stay at home, unfortunately. So we're flying. You can see there's different views that we've been taking in as we've climbed out of London City Airport. We're heading to the east-southeast over the Thames River. The Thames River is below us. We just passed beyond what's called the Queen Elizabeth II Bridge at Dartford, and that's the easternmost crossing of the Thames. If you go online afterwards, our website has a lot more information about all the things that we've been flying over, the sites and the history and the stories that go along with our travel. That's one of the reasons we wanted to do this program, because it gives people the experience of travel while we're still all stuck at home. And our philosophy is that as a museum, we're dedicated to preserving history, specifically the history of New Hampshire aviation, but in a broader sense, we want to encourage people, especially young people, to be curious about the world and to want to learn about science, about the world around them, which also includes history, geography, and culture. So there's a lot to see and do as we travel the world. Now, we're heading towards, our first destination is Canterbury, which is the site of Canterbury Cathedral, and we'll be able to see some of these things quite clearly with the way we come in close to them. But we're still, I think we're going to be about 20 minutes away from Canterbury. Is that right at this point?
We got about 18 minutes.
18 minutes to Canterbury as we fly southeast into the Kentish countryside of England on, again, what's a beautiful day. This landscape might be familiar to 10 minutes. We're getting a little closer. Okay. Chuck, let me ask you, can you talk a little bit about your background and how you came to know this countryside when you were over there a few years ago?
Okay, well, the time in Europe for me in England came sort of in the middle of my naval career. Started in 1955, commissioned in the Navy, and went to aviation flight training in Pensacola, but I ended up, after some squadron duty and maritime patrol flying, at graduate school at the College of Aeronautics in Cranfield, England, which is somewhat north of where we are here now, north and a little bit west. But I was also, while I was doing that, it was the Navy's policy to keep us pilots proficient in flying. So they provided an airplane for us to fly out of West Malling, an airport that is somewhat south of here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm familiar with this part of the country because I would have to go from school in Cranfield about once a month at least down to West Malling in Kent to fly a Navy airplane to keep my proficiency up.
And this is all when you were in the service, of course.
This is all active in the middle of my naval career, which lasted from 55 up through 1983. And I retired as a captain, as he said, as an aviator with a good deal of flying experience as well as a master's degree in aeronautical engineering and a good deal of service in the technical field as well.
Yeah, well, now is the weather that we have today is really nice. Is that typical for this part of the world?
Well, if we were lucky, it was typical. So anything typical was probably lucky there. But this is a beautiful day to fly, as I said in the beginning, except that you don't get the experience that you get flying usually out of southeast England. Usually it's anything from foggy, rainy, even some snow sometimes.
Yes.
As bad winter weather as you see in New England.
Well, you know, we talk about that in some of the other segments. If people later on go click around on our website, you'll see that we get into how the latitude, you know, the height of the land on the globe is much more northerly than we are in New England, but it's in some places warmer. And it's all about the Gulf Stream and how that
And the Gulf
influences
Stream brings the
the
moisture,
climate.
which is what changes the weather.
Yeah, so these are things that you learn when you travel around. Now, the aircraft we're in, we should talk a little bit about that. Bob Huff, this is a C-47, and it's a legendary plane. Why is that so? And what can you tell us about it?
Well, a C-47 is a military version of the DC-3, and it's got a wingspan of about 95 feet, and its height is 16 feet and a length of 64 feet. And it was really the first modern designed airliner of its time, and it first flew in I think it's 1936. It first flew, and
It was first put in service by American Airlines. That's right. Even today we have American Airlines with us, and they were the airline that introduced this aircraft as a modern commercial airliner.
right, it was to answer a request for quote from American Airlines, and several companies applied for it, and Douglas won out with this airliner, and it's been just a useful aircraft both in passenger service and freight service since it first came out, and it's still in use today, especially in foreign countries in remote operations, because it's such a good short-field aircraft. And it's powered by two Pratt & Whitney 1830 radial engines, 1200 horsepower apiece, and that's 14 cylinders. It's two rows of 7-cylinder radial engines, and so it's really just a great aircraft. It's fun to fly. It flies like a big J3 Cub. It's very docile. It's good short field, and it hauls almost 10,000 pounds useful load. So it's really a very versatile and great aircraft to be flying in, and it's a privilege for us to be flying in it today.
Well, and this aircraft was part of what we're going to be talking about later. The invasion of Europe in 1944 by the Allied forces used hundreds and hundreds of these aircraft to support. They were not the fighter aircraft. These were the transports. These were the ones that carried the paratroopers over behind enemy lines to jump out. They played such a heroic role in the success, what became the successful operation of D-Day, and in so much else of World War II, whether it was North Africa or other parts of Europe. These planes were there because, as Bob said, they were reliable and they were versatile. My own dad was a pilot in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and his aircraft was the C-47, and he later flew it as a DC-3 for Northeast Airlines here in Boston and New Hampshire, where we're based. It looks like we're getting close to the town of Canterbury. Is that right?
Yeah, about 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Bob Huff.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. The plane was so versatile and so popular that the C-47 version, the military version, there were over 10,000 of those built, and that's an incredible large number. So you just know how useful it was to the military especially.
Yes.
I think the other thing that they did that was useful on D-Day was to tow gliders.
That's right. Many of the landings that took place behind enemy lines, which we'll talk about, were made through gliders that put troops down behind the German fortifications to try to secure crossroads and other key points in Normandy so that the Allies could gain their foothold. So there was a lot going on that day that we'll talk about as we get closer to Normandy. We're coming in on Canterbury now, and let's take a couple of moments to think about what we're looking at here. We're going to see a very big church, a cathedral, Gothic cathedral, and we're still right over the beautiful green English countryside right now. But as we get closer, we'll see this cathedral, and we can look at it and see it as a building, but it's been there over 1,000 years. And even before that, there was a church there because this area was sort of a religious center going even back before that. This, you may have heard of a book that was written very early on, the Canterbury Tales. And the gentleman who wrote that, Geoffrey Chaucer, wrote it in the form of tales about pilgrims who were traveling from London, like we are, to Canterbury. Now, it's taken us about 20 minutes to get to Canterbury. Back in the 1300s, when Geoffrey Chaucer was writing about the experience, you'd not travel by DC-3, you would travel on foot or by horseback. And it typically took 4 days. You'd have 3 nights in inns along the way. And the Canterbury Tales was the story of a group of, I think, 24 pilgrims who were making their way from London to Canterbury Cathedral. They were specifically going to the shrine of Thomas Becket, and we have a lot of information about his role in English history and why there's a shrine to him on our website. But that was why these pilgrimages were being made at the time. And Chaucer was able to put all these stories in one place in a book, the Canterbury Tales. It was written in, not in English, but in Middle English, which is sort of an early version of the tongue that we speak today. And it was one of the first works of literature to be written in that language. And at the time, the language of learning would have been Latin, and the language of the court might have been an early version of French because of the Norman invasion in England. But in this case, this was Middle English, or a medieval form of English, that Chaucer wrote. And you can just barely understand it today if you read it. And it's been, of course, translated into regular English, and it's still popular. But what's interesting about this book is that it was popular even before we had the printed word, before we had the movable type and the printing presses. Copies of it had to be made by hand. And so to have several hundred copies out and circulating was quite an accomplishment for that time. And here we are right where all that happened. It isn't just something someone made up. We're in the place where that happened.
Actually, we're approaching it now. That was another town.
Oh, we're still a little bit away
Still
from
a little bit out
Canterbury.
here on the horizon.
Okay.
We'll circle around the cathedral.
Very good. Very good. Okay.
Yeah,
So
and I'll have to say, during the entire trip, the number of cathedrals and beautiful architecture we've seen is just incredible. And to think about how far the history goes back on these buildings compared to the U.S. and our relatively short history, it's just incredible, the history that we've been able to see from the air.
We've also been able to see the North Sea off to the left quite often here. Wasn't that far from the coastline.
yeah, we're essentially going to be following the coast. Once we get to Canterbury, we'll turn south to Dover. There's the North Sea, the end of it where it meets the English Channel. This land of southeast England has been part of English history, of course, for several thousand years. The Romans were here for several hundred years, and they had a town where Canterbury is now. In many cases, the Danish were here to invade southeast England and occupied it for some time as well. The cathedral is one of the earlier Christian cathedrals, but the site of it was one of the first Christian churches in England, and it later became the cathedral that we can see today. So here we are coming towards Canterbury. The thing about when you travel, I think we'll see the cathedral out our right hand or our starboard side pilot's window, unless we change the view. Let's take a view there. The cathedral, let's see if we can zoom in on that somehow. The cathedral is part of a living community. It's not just the Disneyland here. This is Canterbury is a small city. I forget the population of it. I was able to visit Canterbury several years ago, and you can see the cathedral coming right into the center of our view now. And it's a tremendous structure that, as Bob said, it's just these things don't get built in a couple of weeks. It took hundreds of years for it to look the way it does now, and it's seemingly always under renovation or construction too, because it needs to be taken care of. This is the center church for the Church of England, which is the mother church of the Anglican Communion. It's the church that represents the religion that was founded in England by Henry VIII, which there's a name we know. Henry VIII, of course, had some marital issues, and the Pope didn't approve of what he was doing, and so Henry said, well, I'll start my own church, and that's why the Church of England, greatly oversimplifying it, but that's the church that now is headquartered at this cathedral.
I was able to visit there in December of 1962, I believe, about very near Christmas time, and I visited because I was at Westmoreland to fly and couldn't fly because the weather was so foggy. So I made my way over to Canterbury Cathedral and heard a choir singing there in the Christmas Eve season.
Oh, that must have been
It
wonderful.
was beautiful.
Yes. I think it's also worth noting, if folks haven't traveled in Europe, you'll see that the city just sort of stops and then the countryside starts. And when I first lived over there, I thought that's kind of unnatural. You know, it's not my experience. Growing up in America, I was used to having like South Willow Street or, you know, commercial strips that gradually transition to a rural area. And in Europe and in Britain, the planning that they have to try to use the land as effectively as possible is what you see there. That's why the neighborhoods will just stop and then open fields are right across the street. And we don't really see a lot of that in the United States, for better or worse. It's just the way they've decided to manage the land. It might be a function of the fact that they're smaller countries and they have to be more mindful about how the land is used. So that was Canterbury, and that was a terrific job circling over that cathedral without getting us in any trouble, I guess, right?
Oh, the plane handles like a dream.
It does.
You wouldn't know you're in such a big aircraft.
Well, the next destination is the White Cliffs of Dover, and those are going to come up actually pretty quickly. But before we do that, I want to take a moment to let people know that the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire is a non-profit educational and historical museum. We're based at the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport in Manchester, New Hampshire, though we're kind of on a field trip today, aren't we? A little far away from home. And you'll see, if you'd like to, as a nonprofit, we survive and prosper based on the worth of our programs and people supporting them. And if you later on would like to do that, if you go to that address, you can donate through PayPal and other methods. That would be terrific, because we do hope to do more programs like this, and that happens with your support. It also happens with the support of some specific sponsors for our journey. You've probably seen some logos on our plane. It's starting to get kind of crowded with logos, but let me just quickly walk you through folks who've been so generous to support us. The Wirebelt Company of New Hampshire is an international manufacturer of metal mesh conveyor belts, which are actually very important in food processing, and they're made right here in Londonderry, New Hampshire, and we really appreciate their support. New Hampshire Humanities has given us some grant money through the CARES Act to pursue this project, and we thank them for that. Our home airport, Manchester-Boston Regional Airport, is a sponsor. You'll see them on our tail, as well as Signature Flight Support, which is the flight support company here right at the airport that handles general aviation and private aircraft. We also have the Queen City Rotary Club has donated to us, and supporting us in kind is J.D. Carter. He's the guy who's our flight engineer and controller today. And Jay is an information technology professional who works with small businesses and consults. You can find him at J-A-Y-D as in dog, Carter.com. And then also, not with us, but with us in spirit, is our web guru, Aura Lasala, who has a business called So Many Aircraft. And that's one of the logos you'll see on the plane. And So Many Aircraft publishes reference material for scale modelers and other aviation enthusiasts. You can visit him at somany-aircraft.com. So thank you again to all the sponsors who've generously supported this program. We're going to continue our flight around the world as long as it takes to get back to New Hampshire sometime this summer when our museum reopens to the public. Right now, like so many cultural attractions, we've been closed due to the governor's orders here in New Hampshire, but we hope to reopen sometime this summer in some way. And when we do, we're hoping to return to Manchester in not virtual form, but with a real DC-3 coming in for a landing and celebrate the end of our around-the-world adventure. I guess we're getting close to the coast now. Chuck, White Cliffs of Dover, did you get to see those when you were over there?
I think we made it on a weekend trip sometime.
Oh.
I saw them, certainly felt the chalk feeling to them.
Yeah.
Nothing more than that, really.
Yes, and you know, it's the White Cliffs of Dover. A lot of people know about them just because of the song that was written about them, or featured them in the lyrics. There'll be bluebirds over the White Cliffs of Dover, which became kind of an anthem for servicemen and women during the time of World War II, which is what we're talking about today.
The next line, I think, was, "Tomorrow, just you wait and see."
Tomorrow, just you wait and see. And it was one of these anthems that gave people hope, I think, at a time when, you know, we look back at history. When we think about this, we look back at World War II. We know how it turned out. We don't have to worry about, like, how it could go wrong at any time. And in 1944, that was not the case. It was a problem that no one knew how it could be solved and what was going to happen. I think people were confident that the Allies would eventually prevail by 1944 anyway, but there were no guarantees. And I hope we can remember that on Memorial Day, that the people who were part of that effort didn't know what would happen. And that must have been a big part of the fear and the uncertainty that any person in the service faces when there's a wartime campaign going on.
Yeah, they didn't know how the war would turn out, and they didn't know how their lives would turn out, or their lives might end. And they really were willing to sacrifice for what they believed in. And so it's really, I have an enormous amount of respect for the people that participated, and it's something we should never forget. And I'm thrilled to be able to recognize them in this way today.
You know, well said. And what we're going to see are the Cliffs of Dover. You can actually start seeing them now. Look at the way the water comes out with the light on it. My God, that's really impressive. And the countryside just stops, and then these cliffs go right into the sea. And what you're seeing is, we know them as the White Cliffs of Dover, but when you look at it in terms of geology, we're seeing a history of the world laid out for us to see, almost like a reference book. And scientists can date where these the time that what we see came from. What we're seeing is not rock. We're seeing the compressed remains of small sea creatures. And as I understand it, over millions of years, as the sea creatures died and fell to the seabed, they would build up in different layers, and the weight would gradually compress them to a substance that we can call chalk, but it's essentially the remains of sea creatures. And then the way that the Earth has moved, I guess, so to speak, is that that's been lifted up so we can see it all at once as we travel over the coast of England here. The White Cliffs are at their highest about 350 feet right out of the ocean. And it's not a continuous thing. They kind of come and go as you go up and down the coast. But in Dover is where they're most prominent. And it's funny because right where they're the most prominent, which is what we're looking at now, is about where England is closest to France. And the English Channel, which we're over, is at its most narrow. And you can just barely see from France, you can just barely see those white cliffs on the horizon. And that's why I think that song gave people so much hope, that it was something visible from Europe under the occupation of Hitler's troops for all those years in the early 40s. And as we're looking around, is that France we see off in the distance? We can just barely see it. We're up at a higher altitude. What are we at now, about 2,000?
I think we're about 1,500.
1,500 feet? 1,800, okay. And we use English measurements for our flying purposes, but meters are used a lot too. We're going over Dover now, and Dover is, you can see some of the ships that are in port there. Dover, being so close to France, was the classic get to France quick port where you take a ferry or a hovercraft. When I was a student, that's what you do, take a train from London and you get over to Calais on a boat. It was big business until about 1994, I think, is when the Channel Tunnel opened up, which linked the Great Britain, the island of Great Britain, to Europe. And that was something that various people, including Napoleon, had dreamed about for military purposes. Could they build a tunnel? Could they get some land connection to connect with Great Britain? Because the English Channel and all the other water around Great Britain effectively was a moat that protected the island. Well, the Channel Tunnel was finally constructed in the late 80s and early 90s, and now is a major method to get from Britain to France. And we're going to be flying over, the next town over is Folkestone, and I believe the Channel Tunnel staging yards will be visible to us, and you can see where the rail line goes into the hole and goes under the channel. And I think it's 30 miles long at this point to get from one end of the tunnel to the other. It's a high-speed rail line that was built that can take you from London to Paris in about 2.25 hours. I've had the privilege of riding on that, and you go through the tunnel at about 100 miles an hour effectively, but the real high-speed part in France, when you come out of the tunnel, the train immediately, you think you're going fast, right? You come out of that tunnel, and then it just starts accelerating, and you're like a plane that's trying to take off, but it doesn't take off. You're right there on the ground until you're traveling faster than you really ever have on the surface of the planet. And what was impressive to me was that I had like a styrofoam cup of coffee, and it was on a flimsy airline seat style tray. And I didn't notice it at first, but I looked down and I saw that even though we were going, I think 186 miles an hour, 300 kilometers an hour, that styrofoam coffee cup was not rippling. It was rock solid. So it was quite a thing to experience that. I think this is Folkestone now, is it, Jay? Yeah, and we're going to see the Channel Tunnel's staging yards coming up as we make our way down the coast. If you're just joining us, this is the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire's live stream flight from London City Airport to the airport in Caen, France. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that, but that's the airport closest to the beaches of Normandy, which we'll be seeing later on in our flight. So to your right, you can see some of the, that looks like just some highway stuff. There we are, right in the center now, center up. We're seeing there's these staging yards where all of the trucks that want to go to Europe get on these special carriages that get pulled through the tunnel. You can't drive through this tunnel. You have to put the truck on a rail car. And the passenger trains bypass all that, and they just go whipping right into that tunnel, which is kind of where that blue, it looks like a little pond is. There's that's where the entrance to the tunnel actually is. It'll take you over to France. So again, if you're just joining us, we are going to be flying across the English Channel in a little bit, but right now we're following the English coast, which has a story to tell all its own. There's a lot of history here, and a lot of interesting sights and some things to see along the way, so I'm glad you're joining us. I'm going to check and see, because I haven't done this while we've been talking. We have quite a few people. It's great to see so many people tuning in, and we have some comments from folks. Jamie Epping has informed us that London City Airport is smaller than Manch Vegas. And it's true that the airport in London is actually on reclaimed land at what used to be their docking area, and it's no longer used for that because most of the cargo coming in and out of that part of the UK is further upstream in the Thames, because it had to be restaged there for bigger boats, essentially, ships. And so that whole area of London's been redeveloped in certain ways, and so London City Airport is the remains of one of the cargo unloading areas. It is a small one runway airport that is nothing like Heathrow Airport, which we saw coming into London in the prior segment to this. So other comments. As just a production note, someone says Chuck is hard to hear. So when we talk, just make sure we're like close to the microphone, I guess. That's good to know. All feedback is appreciated. Now, we're going over a coast that you can still see some of the white, chalky cliff material, but it's not as dramatic as in Dover. What we're going to see coming up is some beaches, but they're very different from beaches that we're used to here in New Hampshire, say, or in Hawaii or the Caribbean. A lot of times when you say a beach, you think of sand and surf and fun. And in England, the beaches on the seaside, to a large extent, are not like that. They're made up of stones and pebbles. And it can be kind of surprising if you're not ready for that. That's a function, of course, of the geology and the substructure of the rock underneath the water and how it gets pushed up onto the shore. But it's not like what we're used to here in New Hampshire. And I think that's one of the reasons that you go traveling, because even a beach can be completely different in a place that might seem so similar, because it has amusements and food and all the fun things you'd see at a beach, but it's just not the same kind of beach that we expect. Before we get to those beaches, we're going to go over a town called Hastings, and that's a little ways away. Is that right, Jay?
Yes.
So we have a few minutes to talk a little bit more about our aircraft. I'd like to ask Bob, if we look at the instrument panel, which has all these dials and gauges, I think if someone has never flown a plane, the first question that people have is, do you need all that stuff? Is there a reason for all that? Or is that just kind of like to impress people?
You don't need all of it, but if you're going to be flying in very diverse conditions, then yes, you do. So what we see here are a directional gyro, so you can know what direction you're heading. We have an artificial horizon or attitude gyro, which is just to the very center right now. It has a virtual airplane and the horizon there. That tells us whether we're banking or turning. When we're in the cloud, you cannot tell whether you're turning or not, so that helps you to be able to know your attitude. And then below that is a vertical speed indicator. And then to the right of that is a turn and bank indicator, and that tells you whether you're in coordinated flight or whether you're turning left and right, and what your rate of turn is, whether you're turning left and right.
Now
And then-
you're moving the steering wheel up and down. What's going on there?
Well, that's the control column, and so when you turn it left and right, that's allowing the wings to turn. So it rotates the plane along its longitudinal axis and allows the plane to turn left or right. And then you pull it back and push it forward, and that moves the control surfaces on the horizontal stabilizer, which is in the rear, and that's the elevator, and that allows it to go up and down.
Now on the far left, who's that a picture of there?
Well, during the war, a lot of the pilots had their favorite actress or girlfriend or wife, and so that's a picture of Marilyn Monroe.
You know, I bring it up because we just got a comment from someone. William Barron's, Jeff, was the picture of Marilyn Monroe standard installation for the instrument panel?
Yes, that's part of the CAA type certificate for the aircraft. So it's a required part of the aircraft that must be there in order for the plane to be considered airworthy.
Okay, I'm glad we asked.
And right next to Marilyn, to the right,
Oh,
Marilyn's left, our right, is the airspeed indicator. So that tells us our speed through the air. And
Chuck, were you chiming in? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that's next to her, the airspeed indicator then is the most important thing in many cases to know what it's doing.
I think another comment, someone writes that their son says the plane looks like CGI. He wants to know if it's real or not. Well, this is a virtual flight over the English Channel, so not only is the plane virtual, but everything you're seeing is being rendered using software. We like to think we carry the illusion that we're actually there along, the lines of putting on a good show, but everything you're seeing is being generated by essentially sim software. There's a whole community of people that work on trying to make flight simulators as realistic as possible, and we're using that software, including the one that created the plane, to do this. And the plane handles like a real DC-3. You have to be able to fly a 2-engine aircraft and know how to set the flaps and how to do all the maneuvers to be able to land successfully, which we've so far been able to do.
Yes, and the realism is just incredible. The detail that you can see both in the cockpit and on the ground is quite remarkable, and it's very impressive.
Okay, now I think
there must have been some aerial photography involved in creating these simulated scenes also. They're just so accurate.
yeah, I think to just layman it a little bit, yeah, you can take Google Earth, for instance, and feed that into an algorithm that will allow you to create a very high resolution depiction that's workable in all axes, essentially. No matter where you're coming from, you'll be able to see it. So when we fly over the Eiffel Tower, which will be our next segment, we're going to fly around it, and you'll see the tower is 1,000 feet tall. So it changes shape differently than the stuff below it because of the perspective. And this scenery catches all of that. And you'll see the way that they've rendered the water, for instance. That I don't know how you can do that so that it fools the eye that way, but that's all ones and zeros. That's all data that we're being spread. And our flight plan is following a path that's all numbers, and the scenery matches those numbers as we go in real time along our flight path. And I think, Jay, are people seeing the?
Yeah, this is an aeronautical chart showing our.
We
flight
give
path.
Jay the mic here.
We're right about here, I believe. Actually, no, I'm sorry. I think we're a little further along. We're somewhere right around in here. So heading towards this Seaford navigational beacon, and then we'll turn up along and continue to follow the coast over towards Hastings.
Okay, good. All right. It's good to know sort of where we are. But in terms of piloting, dead reckoning is still a skill that I think should be valued. You can't just rely on instruments. You can't just rely on numbers. You should have some awareness of where you are in the landscape at all times. Is that right, Bob?
That's correct. And I think about the early aviators who did it all by dead reckoning. You look at Lindbergh, for example, how he went from the U.S. to France, and all dead reckoning. He didn't have navigational beacons or anything like that. And they would sometimes after Lindbergh, they would drop something out of the airplane to look at its drift to be able to determine how the winds were pushing the plane around, or you get low to the ocean and see how you were drifting one way or the other. But it was really, heading and airspeed and trying to estimate the winds to get to your destination. Much easier now with navigational beacons, and especially now today with GPS to navigate. But back then, my hat is off to them to be able to navigate as accurately as they did without any kind of outside navigational capability other than looking at the ground. You're over the water, there's no landmarks, but over the ground you can look at landmarks and that sort of thing. So really quite remarkable how they used to be able to navigate.
Yeah, a lot of them didn't even have a compass to go by, and they might tend to really depend on the land and what they could see of the land and their familiarity with it. But as a Navy pilot, I'd have to tell you, as soon as you leave the shore and head out over the ocean,
Right.
it's a different ballgame.
Yeah.
And you really need some help
Yeah.
in terms of radio aids or in terms of even an accurate compass.
Wow. Well, to touch on D-Day again, which is what we're going to be talking about more in a little bit, I want to say we've got a comment from someone whose grandma lives in Caen and is watching right now. So we have people
Oh, wow.
in Caen watching us. Andrew Bruder, I spent 3 years with the RAF as a USAF RAF exchange officer at HQ RAF Strike Command in High Wycombe from 84, I think that's High Wycombe, from 84 to 87. Got to fly a lot of RAF aircraft and travel over a lot of England. So it's great how this can bring memories back
Yeah.
for people.
Well, thank you for your service. That's wonderful.
And we also have, I've been to the Ernie Alfano from Boston, says it's great, and he's been to the beaches and cemeteries in Normandy, and it's one of his favorite trips. It's very moving, and the countryside is beautiful, and we'll see that, I think. People on D-Day would not have been enjoying the beautiful countryside, of course, because it was a whole different ball game at that point. And regarding the, Bob mentioned the weather. On June, the original plan for D-Day was much earlier. It was supposed to be in May, and it got moved back. There were only certain windows, just like when we do our spacecraft launching to the moon. You can only launch at certain times because of the position of the moon. In D-Day, there was only a few days each month that we could have done the invasion because of the tides and different other combinations. And June 5th was going to be the day it was supposed to happen, but the weather was not favorable, and General Eisenhower made the call, we'll do it the next day. Because after that, they would have had to wait another 2 weeks to carry out all of that. And it was the right call because 2 weeks later, the English Channel was socked in by a major prolonged storm, and they never could have done it. And that would have given the Germans a lot more time to figure out what was going on, and they would have lost the element of surprise. So in terms of history, we know how it worked out, and we can see he made the right call. But can you imagine the pressure about what to do about the weather on June 5th? Should we do it? Should we wait? It's hard to imagine what it would be like for someone in the high command, but also just someone who was going to participate in this maneuver, waiting for their orders to ship out.
Yeah, and they wanted to do it at high tide, and they wanted a new moon at the same time as well. So a lot of factors to weigh in on the timing of the invasion.
Now, what's our airspeed right now? Probably 100.
Airspeed is about 135.
135.
Let's take a look at the GPS and see what our ground speed is. Yeah, right about the same. So very little wind right now. Ground speed and airspeed, you'll be able to see that change and vary a little bit, the difference between them.
Okay, yeah, Jay is, in case it's hard to hear, Jay is talking about what you're seeing on the screen is we're making sure by GPS we know where we are. But our ground speed and airspeed are about the same, which means there's very, very little wind. If you've flown across the Atlantic, you may have heard pilots talk about the jet stream, which can be hundreds of miles in your favor or not per hour, whether you're coming or going west to east or vice versa. And so it really makes a difference. The speed that the airplane is traveling relative to the ground can be different than its airspeed.
Sure, and we all know when you go in the U.S. from the East Coast to the West Coast, we tend to have a headwind, and so we're going slower. The airspeed will be the same, but the speed over the ground will be slightly slower because you're moving in a mass of air that's trying to push you back to the East Coast. When you go from the West Coast to the East Coast, you've got a tailwind, so you're going faster along the ground, so it's helping you move through the air. But to the airplane, the airspeed is the same, regardless of what the ground speed is.
So if you're going to be a pilot, you have to do a little math. Is that right?
Well, the indicated airspeed is really the critical thing to be paying attention to, because that's an indication of the amount of lift on the wing. So when you go up a little bit higher, the air's thinner, so your airspeed will indicate a little bit slower, but that's proportional to the amount of lift that air can create. So the higher you go, the air creates less lift, so you have to go faster through the air. And so the indicated airspeed is a good indication of the amount of lift that the air can provide to the aircraft. So for flying purposes, indicated airspeed is king. That's what you want to pay attention to landing and taking off. What your ground speed is irrelevant compared to the airspeed. Now, when you do land, you want to land into the wind, so your ground speed is as low as possible. You don't want to be landing fast. You don't want to use up a lot of runway. But in terms of lift on the wings, the indicated airspeed is the most important.
We'll try to keep all that in mind when we come in for our landing in a little bit.
Absolutely. Now, there is something called calibrated airspeed, and that's the indicated airspeed corrected for error. And it's usually pretty close. And so basically indicated is what we use when we're flying.
Well, let me point out that we're over Hastings now. Is that right?
No.
No, not yet.
I believe I'm just trying to check on that. No, Hastings is...
Still coming up?
No, I think we passed Hastings.
Oh, while we were talking, we went...
Beachy Head off to our left.
Okay, so we're a little bit beyond it. I wanted to mention Hastings because it's one of those names that you hear from history books, when you're just going through school. 1066, the Battle of Hastings. And if you just read a history book, it's just another date. It's just another battle. But when you actually go to the location of it, which we passed over just a little bit ago, it lends it a whole nother level of meaning. And the reason we're traveling around the world is to visit some of these places that are not just dates and names in books. These are real living parts of the human experience. They may be from another culture, they may be from another time, but they're threads from that came from those events have been woven into our lives in ways that we don't understand or appreciate, but we can start to if we think about them and sort of fit them together in this great big puzzle of history. So in 1066, William the Conqueror came over from France and beat the Anglo-Saxon kings, and then went to London that year and had himself crowned king in Westminster Abbey, which we saw earlier. Westminster Abbey was the church that was built slightly before him, but it's still used for royal weddings and other things like that. So it's part of today's culture as well. But the Norman conquerors, starting with William the Conqueror, brought a whole different way of governing to England. I think when we hear of people being conquered, we often think of damaging things and breaking things. And William was turned out to be what history thinks of as an excellent king, where he tried to make something of this land that he came to rule over. A little while into his reign, he created a census, which is now called the Domesday Book, which was an effort to try and tally up all the assets of the land and see how it could be governed, and of course collect taxes and all that as well, because some people had been a little remiss in paying taxes over the years while all the turmoil was happening. But he went on to found so many things in England that are with us today. They brought the French language to the court and to aristocracy, and that gradually got threaded together with the Middle English of Chaucer and other people to create English that we'd recognize, say, in Shakespeare's time, which is much more similar to what we have now than what Chaucer would have known. So we're over the town of, do we know yet?
Yeah, coming up on New Haven.
New Haven, okay, and that's another port city that I traveled through New Haven in 1984. I took a ferry from Dieppe, France to New Haven, England, and it had been my first time traveling around Europe, my first time being around people where English was not the regular language. And to a young student, I have to admit, when I stepped off the boat in New Haven after being in Europe and being surrounded by people who spoke French and German and other language that I hadn't mastered, I never felt more like I was coming home when I heard the guy at customs saying, everyone off to the right, UK citizens to the left. And I felt I'm home again. It's all part of traveling, because you get exposed to things that are not in your comfort zone, and you find out about yourself as well as the places you're visiting. So the coast of southern England, very scenic, very beautiful, and we get small communities that are there that are kind of evidence of England's history as a maritime society. If you can recall the lyrics to the song "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves," and that was emblematic of how Britain was able to parlay a nation into a world empire through their mastery of the seas. Of course, the British Empire became a collection of other lands that the sun never set on, it was said, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire, and it was true, because no matter where you were on the globe, the sun was always shining on either South Africa or India or Australia or Canada, and for a little while, what became the United States.
And at one point it covered a quarter of the world's population. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was one of those facts that you kind of think about. That's really impressive for a relatively geographically small nation to have assembled an empire like that.
If you have time for a little story at this point.
Of course we do.
The one thing the British did during World War II, when they were concerned about the Germans invading England, was to take down all the road signs
Yeah.
and take down all the train station signs. And of course, then that left some of the natives a little confused too. So there's a story about a train that was coming in to a familiar station, and the conductor kind of lost his place about where he was. And so he figured out the thing he would say was, "Here we are for where we're going. All you in there for here, get out."
That took
You
care
could do
of it.
that with a good English accent. That's kind of cute.
Oh boy. So the this is Brighton. Wow, Brighton came up faster than I expected. Brighton is worth commenting because you can see one. It's the greatest example of the traditional amusement pier that's sort of on the left of center there, and this is 1,700 feet long, I read, and it's part of an amusement culture that the British seaside created starting in the 1800s, when people were first able to travel by train from a city like London in one day, come down to the seaside and enjoy a day at the beach and then get home. And so for quite some time now, Brighton has been one of the traditional centers of the sort of British seaside day trip. In recent decades, a lot of people in Britain will travel instead to Spain and other places where there's warmer climates. And so these old seaside resorts can tend to be a little bit underutilized now, but they're still marvelous places where people can go and get close to the water and have a change of pace. And I think these piers, if you come to the beach, you want to be close to the ocean. And so these piers allow you to go right out onto the water and breathe the sea air. And I think there's, in this pier, there are rides, I think. There are roller coasters and other things. So it's all part of the British South Coast like this. But there are other resorts in other parts of Britain, like Blackpool and other things. And they all have their claim to fame as destinations for your holiday. But we're looking at one of our windows now. You'll notice we have nice curtains. We try to keep the plane looking nice as we travel around. We want to make a good impression in our DC-3. Thinking of Hastings too, which we passed over. We're thinking about World War II today, and Hastings, like a lot of these communities in the English coast, were very tense places throughout World War II, because if the Germans were going to finally make some kind of move to invade the island of Great Britain, it was likely that this is where they would land. And so this area that we're traveling over was a place of a lot of action, military and espionage-wise, throughout the early 1940s. And there's a marvelous TV series called Foyle's War that the BBC did a few years ago, and it takes place in Hastings and the countryside around Hastings during World War II. And there's a police detective who's too old to serve, but he stays with his job throughout the war and winds up breaking up like smuggling rings and people who are taking advantage of wartime chaos to profiteer. And you get such a great sense of what it must have been like back then for people living under such tension and under these conditions, not knowing how it was going to turn out. I guess that's our theme today. People then did not know how it was going to turn out. And so the kind of bravery and courage that went into this is magnified all the more, I think.
Chuck's story was I found that interesting. It reminds me of the church we passed over, Church of England. That was a major target of the Germans during World War II. Because it was such a symbol of the British people. So the residents would light fires around the church to make the Germans think that they had bombed it and they had destroyed it. I thought that was an interesting little anecdote about how they were trying to fool the Germans that the church had been bombed.
Yes, and that whole area of southeast England was sort of ground zero for the Allied faking out the Germans' actions. They had Patton in there with a whole imaginary army being assembled, ready to invade Europe through the narrowest part of the Channel. And this went on for months, where they were trying to convince the Germans that was where the invasion would take place, in order for them to be able to land in Normandy without being expected. So yeah, that's a very interesting part of wartime, the espionage and the kind of artificial maneuvers that have to be made to create uncertainty and to accomplish your goals. You'll see on our plane we have small flags that show the flags of the nations that we've passed through so far. And they're not quite all exactly national flags. We have the Canadian flag. There's the flag of Greenland, which is almost a completely independent nation. It's still dependent on Denmark for some things. And then we have Iceland, which is an independent nation. Then we have the Scottish flag. And there's a question because you may have heard in the news all about Brexit and how Britain has left the European Union. In Scotland, which has been part of the United Kingdom since I think it was 1707, there's still a very big streak of independence up there. Having lived there for a while, I saw that up close. And it didn't surprise me to see that the Scottish people voted mostly to not leave the European Union for a lot of different reasons. So who knows, but the future may bring Scotland breaking off and rejoining the European Union as an independent nation. We will have to see about that. But we put the flag on anyway.
And the Republic of Ireland still is part of the EU.
Yes, that's right. But Northern Ireland is part of.
Northern Ireland is not.
It's such a puzzle, and if you don't go over there and really understand it, it's hard to speak accurately. Like, what is Great Britain? The island of Great Britain is one thing, but England is different from Scotland.
And then what is the United Kingdom?
What is the United Kingdom? That's also
And what is the Commonwealth?
Yeah.
Yes. So
That's always been confusing to me. England, United Kingdom, Great Britain, all of that.
yes. Well, that's why we travel around the globe to try and get some knowledge about things that aren't part of our direct experience.
And I have to say, during our trips and stops at various places, everybody has just been wonderful. They've been very welcoming. They've been friendly. They can't do enough for us. So it's really been nice to meet people from other cultures and languages and really, see that we're really all the same and we really all want the same things. And we've really enjoyed doing that.
And we've only just begun. If you're just joining us, our live streaming flight from London to Caen, France, is in progress, but it's only one small part of a round-the-world journey that we're making in this venerable C-47 or DC-3 aircraft that you see on the screen. We're flying at about, I'm guessing, 2,000 feet?
Probably a little less.
A little less, so we're flying, say, 130 miles an hour, a little less than 2,000 feet over the southern English countryside on our way to Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight, and then we're going to take a big turn south and cross the English Channel in the same place where so many people did on the night of June 5th and 6th, 1944, to land on the beaches of Normandy and to mark the start of the end of the European part of World War II, which is how it worked out. But again, they didn't know that at the time. What an act of bravery to just go and do that at the time, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we cross the channel. But this is part of a larger journey that we're making that started on May 1st in our home airfield, Manchester Boston Regional Airport in Manchester, New Hampshire. And we've gone through Gander, Newfoundland, and then up to Goose Bay, Labrador, then across to Narsarsuaq, Greenland. Did I pronounce that correctly?
I think
Bob?
you did pretty well.
Narsarsuaq.
Narsarsuaq? Okay. So it used to be called Bluey West 1, right? That's easier to pronounce.
Louis West One.
Yeah. So, but the place name now is Narsarsuaq. We were there for a while. We went over to Reykjavik, Iceland, got to experience the delicious hot dogs of Iceland. We crossed over to Prestwick, Scotland. We learned that that's the only place that Elvis landed in the UK, so it's a shrine for fans of the King. We went down to the Cosford Royal Air Force Museum in the Midlands of England, and then we flew in a big loop over Ireland to visit one of Bob's bucket list places, the Foynes Flying Boat Museum. And
Yes, it's one of the ports of call for the old China Clippers back in the 30s, the big flying boats, luxurious way to fly. And so Foynes, Ireland was one of the terminals for that. And it was a thrill to be able to fly over it, and it is on my bucket list. There are no China Clippers left surviving today, the big flying boats, but they have built a replica at that museum, the
Yeah.
Flying Boat Museum. So it's one place I have to see. But don't forget, before we got to Ireland, we flew over Liverpool,
Yes.
and we got to see the statue of the Beatles from the air in Liverpool.
We had to fly down a little close for that, but that's okay. And then we took a southerly route over Ireland. We flew over my great-grandparents' hometown of Cork, Ireland, and then over the site where the Lusitania went down in 1915. I mean, there's history all around us. Back over to England, you talk about history. Our next spot was Stonehenge, which because I think of social distancing, there's no people there, so we got permission to fly down really low over those ancient stones that are arranged in a way that no one knows for sure, because the people that erected them did not leave any written records from the 3,000 or 4,000 years ago when they were installed. But they line up so that the sun rise and set during the solstices it's uncanny, and so they had to have some significance, some kind of large-scale calendar, and so we got to see that from the air.
Yeah, and there's a special solstice celebration online because they won't be actually open to the public, so they're going to do a celebration online on June 21st, so that might be something you want to check out.
Wow, I wonder if they got that idea from us.
Probably.
Like,
But
why is that plane buzzing over our monument?
I have to say that seeing all these historic sites, and it just brings it alive to me, and it makes me feel like I'm almost a part of it. And I almost feel what it must have been like back then to be able to fly over them and talk about them and see them and just really think about what it was like back then when these events happened.
Well, and then we landed in Southampton after that, take a rest, and then we got back in the plane and flew over Highclere Castle, which people may know as the place where Downton Abbey was filmed, or at least the exteriors were. And I'm not a big Downton Abbey fan, but I looked it up, and I couldn't believe that house, that country estate, was not only where the treaty that made Canada a nation was signed in 1867, but also one of the ancestors of the current family that controls and owns it was on the expedition that discovered the remains of King Tut in Egypt. So there's just history within history all around Europe and everywhere else we're going to be going. So in Jay.
They have an excellent museum in the basement at Highclere Castle of Egyptian artifacts that the Lord Carnarvon of the time brought back. It's fascinating.
You really wouldn't expect that, but you find these things. And that took us, then we took aim at London, and we had a great time flying over Buckingham Palace. Nobody chased us. The Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament. We saw the London Eye, Westminster Abbey. We saw St. Paul's Cathedral. And we didn't quite have the bravery to fly under the Tower Bridge, but we got close enough to it. And that took us where we are now. We're almost towards Portsmouth, England, I think. And there's going to be some things to see here. Jay has been there many times and is going to sort of act as our guide. Before we get there, I'll say after we arrive in France, we're going to be heading up the northern coast of Europe. On our itinerary are the Low Countries, Amsterdam, Brussels and Amsterdam, and then up through northern Germany to land in Copenhagen. We'll do some time in Scandinavia. We're going to come back down through Europe, in the middle of Europe, down into Italy, Greece, then over to Spain, and then things get really interesting when we cross the Straits of Gibraltar and the Strait of Gibraltar and start working our way down the west coast of Africa through Morocco, down to Dakar, Senegal. And the plan is to follow the original route that Amelia Earhart took across the center of Africa. She was flying the Equator route. And that's going to be a real adventure, some real, I guess, aeronautical bushwhacking on our part to get our simulator to take us through these exotic places. And then we'll continue around the world. Your suggestions are welcome. We've been receiving comments from students and teachers about where they'd like us to go. So let me hand it over to Jay to talk a little bit about what we're going to be seeing here. And I want to ask our panel also, we've had one question. What is the difference between a DC-3 and a C-47? And so once we get past Portsmouth and we have a few minutes, we want to talk a bit about that.
Actually, we're still a little bit away. Maybe.
So we have a few minutes. Okay.
Talk about that now.
So it's the same aircraft mostly, but I think if I had to answer that question, I'd say the big difference is with a DC-3, you get like airliner seats. With a C-47, you get benches so paratroopers can jump out the back. But there's more to it than that, I assume.
Yeah, there is, and I can't say I'm an expert on the differences because it can be pretty subtle. But for example, the C-47 has a plexiglass dome for navigation on the top of it,
Mhm.
where you could use a sextant to shoot the stars and determine where you were, where the civilian version, the DC-3, did not have. There you can see the plexiglass dome towards the front. No, that's all right, right there. And so you could shoot the stars through there and determine your position. So the military version had that. And as you say as well, it was configured to be able to handle cargo and convert back and forth pretty easily. And I think the doors in the back were much bigger. Double doors on the back were much bigger to be able to put cargo in. They could even put a Jeep inside this thing.
Wow.
So it was, configured to be able to convert from passenger on bench seats to cargo very quickly.
Well, we've had that confirmed by Ora Lasala, who's our web guru behind the scenes today, and he's got some knowledge of these aircraft. He's photographed them, and he has some beautiful photographs of DC-3s that were used and C-47s that were used last year to travel across the North Atlantic and participate in the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. So if you go to somanyAircraft.com, his website, you'll be able to see those. But he's given us a comment. They're the same, except they were meant for cargo. The C-47, as Bob said, was a cargo aircraft. The doors were a little different in the back. We have our logo on the door. It was designed by our graphic designer, Susan Englert. And so thank you, Susan, for helping us create an image for our adventure.
I just want to add here that Ora's probably forgotten more about airplanes than I've ever known. I mean, he's done a lot of research. His website's wonderful, and he knows a lot about the history of these aircraft. So it's wonderful to have him be our partner on this.
Thank you, Ora. We're getting close to the city of Portsmouth. Among its distinctions is this is where Mr. Charles Dickens was born. I think you've heard of him. Jay, there's things we're seeing now that you've been to and can tell us a little bit about. So I'm going to give you the microphone, or do you want me to just hold it?
Yeah, that's fine. Right now here, right on the coast, you can see that Southsea has a pier just like Brighton and Hastings has, and actually stayed in a hotel that's right across the street from that pier. Right down here in the very bottom corner, I'll bring it up just a little bit, you see this sort of pyramid-shaped building, and just beyond that is a little brown round building, and that is the D-Day Museum that houses a really fascinating tapestry called the Overlord Tapestry. It's 43 panels that were hand embroidered by the Royal School of Needlework.
Wow.
And made to commemorate the D-Day Museum. Tells the whole story of Normandy and the events leading up to it. And just going to pan over here a little bit too and look at Portsmouth Harbor and the Portsmouth Historic Dockyard. You can see that Spinnaker Tower, which is a sort of an observation tower. It's kind of a tourist attraction. Beyond that is HMS Warrior, which is an ironclad ship built in 1860 or launched in 1860. Wow. It has both steam and sail power, and it only had about a 10-year life when it was really useful. But at the time, it was the fastest ship in the Royal Navy.
And Jay, it's that orange color we're seeing there. Is that right?
That's the black hull with the
in the
sails.
water.
Yeah, just beyond that, the brighter color one is HMS Victory, and of course where Trafalgar, the Battle of Trafalgar, and Admiral Nelson commanded and was taken down. The sort of football-shaped building, and we're kind of zipping past now, is houses the Mary Rose, which was a sailing ship in Henry VIII's time that sunk and has been raised and is undergoing a very slow 30-year restoration process to bring it back out into the air so that it doesn't decay when it dries out. And that's a really fascinating visit too there. And the aircraft carrier that we saw, again, we kind of had to make a turn there towards the Isle of Wight, but the aircraft carrier is the HMS Queen Elizabeth, which has kind of a distinctive ski jump on the front rather than a catapult, and is for launching F-35B VTOL fighters and also various helicopters and Royal Marines. And that's the newest aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy. Just had sea trials in 2017, actually visited New York City in 2018, and is now just starting to get joined up by its own squadron of RAF F-35Bs.
Wow, so, it's not just, Memorial Day isn't about, I think, the past all the time, even though it's about those who've given their lives. It shows there's a continuing commitment to military service. all over, even today. Yes, Chuck.
The other important thing that is in Portsmouth, the only ship that I've been aboard there when I visited was the Nelson's HMS Victory, which is the
Yes.
ship on which Nelson died, actually. But
Yeah,
it's
it's-
very important to the history of the Royal Navy during Nelson,
Yeah, it's
Horatio
there.
Nelson's day.
Yeah, it's
It's
kind of
right there, right next to where we saw the Warrior,
Yes, and
walking
it's
distance from the Warrior.
yeah, and it's remarkably preserved, and it's kind of like it's not in the water, is it? It's not like the Constitution in
isn't.
Boston.
Dry dock.
It's on a dry dock. Yeah.
But its tour aboard it is done with pride by Royal Navy veterans, and they give a wonderful tour of the Victory.
That's something to see, and I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the equipment and ships that went over to the Falklands when the British fought the war with Argentina in the early 1980s came out of Portsmouth. It remains a major staging point for the British Navy and military. This island we're over now is the Isle of Wight, and it's not a large island like Greenland, which we went over earlier. It's often called England in miniature, though, and it has the distinction of being the sunniest place in the United Kingdom. And this is a land where there's not as much sunlight as maybe some people would like. And so the fact that the Isle of Wight meteorologically has more hours of sunshine than any other place in the UK is quite a drawing card. And it is now a place where people come for their holidays. That was started by none other than Queen Victoria in the 19th century, who established a vacation home here, essentially. And I don't know if we're close to where that is, Jay, because we were looking at it before and we thought we'd be able to catch a glimpse of it.
Yeah, I've had trouble locating that. But I can, we can pan around and see.
While we look around for it, this island is, as I said, not the biggest island in the world, but it's big enough as, like 10 miles across and about half that. It protects what's called the Solent, which is the water we see behind us now, which is the main entry channel for Southampton. And earlier we saw the Queen Mary II, the giant transatlantic liner, coming up the Solent to get into Southampton. I don't know if there's some action there up even now. I don't know if that's the Queen. I don't know if that's the Queen Mary II coming out.
Maybe
but
there's some Navy ships.
Yeah.
coming to Solomon.
but that channel is well protected by the Isle of Wight. And we've talked about history, and we've gone back quite some time, 1,000 years for the Canterbury Cathedral in 1066. And the Isle of Wight goes back a lot further because, just from some circumstances of geology, it's one of the best places on the planet to find preserved fossils of dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures. And it's, again, an accident of geography where those things were trapped in ways that preserved them and then underground for millions of years, and then because of the movement of the earth have been exposed for us to find them. And even today, the Isle of Wight, I think just this year there was a major discovery of some creature that no one had ever known about, and there it was preserved in the layers of the minerals that you can find eroding over on one coast of the Isle of Wight. So even dinosaurs are part of our flight today, going all the way back in time before we had DC-3s or any kind of aircraft. The Isle of Wight is sort of the last bit of the United Kingdom that will be over. And it was the last bit of land that people on June 5th and June 6th in 1944 would have seen before they made their journey that night in the darkness that was facing them over the English Channel. So I think it's time to just make sure we check in with folks. If you're new to the broadcast, welcome. This is a live stream of a flight in real time from London City Airport throughout southeastern England. We're right now over the Isle of Wight, and we're soon going to be going over the English Channel. It'll take us about 25 minutes before we get very close to the coast of Normandy, and I think it's the Cotentin Peninsula, which is where Cherbourg is. That's the first land we'll see. And after that, we will fly over the beaches of Normandy, specifically Utah and Omaha, before we turn inland to the airport that's our destination today. And we should be there in about an hour or so, just in case you're keeping track of time. My name is Jeff Rapsis. I'm the Executive Director of the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire, which is located in Manchester, New Hampshire, at the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport. But today we're sort of on a field trip. And we are now leaving the coast of the Isle of Wight and looking at the English Channel on what has turned out to be a brilliant day for flying. The weather couldn't be better. The visibility is great. The sunshine is out, and we've just had a terrific chance to see a lot of the history and landscape of southeast England. With me on board today are Jay Carter, who is our flight engineer and running our sort of in-air studio to do this broadcast. So thank you for all that help, Jay. And we have Bob Huff, who is a pilot and a board member of the Aviation Museum.
Hi, everyone, and welcome aboard.
And with us is Chuck Guerin, a career naval captain, and he's with us to lend his experiences from his time over there.
Right. I'm a naval aviator that has some flying experience in this area. As we're crossing over to Europe, I have some experience over there too. Not so much in connection with direct maritime patrol and a submarine warfare work that I did as a Navy pilot, but in between times, in between fleet duty, I was going to graduate school in England and flying a Navy airplane over Europe to keep my proficiency up. This is an interesting area, if I could say it right now, because we're changing over from air traffic control in natural English to air traffic control in official English, because the International Civil Aviation Convention requires English as its standard language. But we're not going to be flying over an English-speaking country. So a lot of the controllers that we'll be talking to are French speakers. And when I was doing flying in this area, I always wondered about how was I going to communicate with these controllers when they're required to speak English. But it isn't always as easy English to understand.
Well, if you explore our website that's all about this Around the World Flight, we're coming into a time where we do speak about languages and how they develop. And French was, for a time, the international language of diplomacy. The aristocracy used it throughout Europe. And even today, you'll look in your passport, and it has things in French because it's still regarded as a language of diplomacy. However, aviation developed at a time when English was transcendent as an international language, but the French were on the cutting edge of aviation, and I think it was an open question as to whether French might have been even today we say Mayday, right? When something's, and that's French for help me. It's not May the 1st, it's Mayday, aid
help
me.
Aid me, yeah.
And so I think
the other one, the English, engineering and science were predominantly a German language, a German-speaking language early in the 20th century, and converted gradually, and certainly after the First World War, into English.
The French were such aviation pioneers that they were very prominent in the challenge that the English Channel presented in the early days of aviation, because here you had London and Paris on both sides of this body of water, and in the early days of aviation, it was just the right size for early aviators to say, I can get across that in my flimsy contraption. And there were great stories about attempts, successful or otherwise. I think one famous one that is still recalled today, Bob, is... the
English Channel is interesting because it's always a challenge to people to do something with it.
Right.
I mean, look at the number of people that have swum the English Channel.
Yes.
It's not my cup of tea, but, there's always a challenge. And a lot of the aviation firsts or records were set by people who were trying to obtain a prize. So somebody put some prize money out there to say, if you can do this, you can get a prize. And so the Daily Mail in 1908, they put out a prize of 500 pounds being offered to anybody who could fly the English Channel before the end of the year. Well, nobody did.
Nobody did.
And the Paris newspaper, Le Matin, did I pronounce that right?
Le Matin, yes.
Le Matin
Mais oui.
said there was no chance of the prize ever being won.
No chance.
No chance whatsoever. But in 1909, the Daily Mail raised the prize to £1,000. And so a lot of people looked at, well, I want to do this. And one fellow, his name was Hubert Latham. He was a French national of English extraction, and he was flying a monoplane. And so in
Monoplane meaning a plane with just one wing.
just one wing,
Yeah.
right. So he set up camp there on the French side, and on July 19th, in 1909, he attempted to fly from France to England across the English Channel. And he got within 6 miles of the coast when his engine quit. So he has the
Not enough room to glide in.
so he has the distinction of being the first one to land in the ocean.
Land in the ocean.
Yeah,
Well-
in the channel, in the channel. Yeah.
Jeez.
So so he, they pulled him out of the water, and he went back to his camp. And the factory that had built the airplane for him sent another one immediately to him. In the meantime, a fellow named Louis Blériot came over and set up camp. And he was planning to fly in one of his own designs. And Louis Blériot is a very interesting person. He was an inventor and an engineer, and he developed the first practical headlamp for cars.
Wow.
And he used that money in his manufacturing of headlamps for cars to fund his interest in aviation. But
Honestly, the Wright brothers did it with bicycles, and he did it with
Yeah,
headlamps.
yeah. And actually, by the time he set up camp on the French side of the English Channel, he was bankrupt, pretty much destitute. But it was his own monoplane design. And for a couple days while he was there, the wind was just way too strong to be able to fly, either for him or for Latham. But on the morning of July 25th, he was awoken by his friend at 4:15 in the morning to say, the winds have died down, let's go. And meanwhile, Latham stayed in bed. And so he got up, they got ready, he did a test flight, made sure everything was fine. And then at 4:41, and they picked 4:41 because the sun had to be up. And 4:41 was the sunrise, and because the price said you had to do it between sunrise and sunset. So at 4:41 he took off. And that's when Latham realized maybe he missed his opportunity. And he scrambled to get ready, but by the time he got ready, the winds had picked up again and he couldn't go. So Blériot flew at 45 miles an hour at an altitude of 250 feet. We're doing it a little bit faster and a little bit higher. But I just find that interesting to be that low to the water.
And we have to remember, this was only 25 years or so before World War II and what we're kind of reenacting today. And how much of an advance is what they were working with compared to what we have in an aircraft that was actually flying in 1935. So we're talking a very short period of
It's
development.
amazing how fast the technology of aviation has progressed. Louis Blériot was flying just 16 years after the Wright brothers had flown. That's just incredible to me. But he made it across. He was a little bit off course because he had followed a ship, but then he overtook the ship, and he was in a little bit of the fog, and he was blown off course, but he flew along the coast until he saw a newspaper man waving the tricolor flag, and he landed. So he was the first man, the first flight across the English Channel on July 24th, 1909.
1909.
Yeah. And he
Wow.
became very famous, and his aircraft business really picked up because he sold a lot of aircraft. So he's the first man to fly across the Atlantic.
Yeah, I read the David McCullough book about the Wright brothers that came out about 10 years ago or so, and I didn't know what the situation was when the Wrights went over to France after they had successfully mastered the art of heavier than air flight. And it caused such a sensation because the French felt they were sort of the leaders of this field, and the Wrights just blew everybody away with what they were able to do.
Yeah, it's very, very true. The newspaper editor that the Daily Mail that put this prize out wanted the Wright brothers to enter.
Mm.
And the Wright brothers were just a little bit beyond the tour they had been doing of Europe, and Orville was recuperating in the U.S. from an accident.
Mm.
And they decided they had already broken so many records, both speed and altitude records and distance. They decided they would not risk their flyer over the water, so they didn't even enter. But you're right. When the Wright brothers went to France, I think it was 1908. Nobody believed they had really done what they said they had done. And after they flew around this circuit, I think it was
Mhm.
at a racetrack.
Yes.
And the headlines in the paper the next day, big headlines, said, "We are beaten." What the Wright brothers could accomplish with their aircraft in 1908 far exceeded what anybody else could even think of. It was
Yeah.
quite remarkable what the Wright brothers accomplished.
And to some extent, they weren't that well received here initially. The competition being Langley and the
Right.
Smithsonian. And we were not really, I think one reason they went to France had to do with better reception over there than they were getting right here in that first decade of the 20th century.
That's true.
Yeah.
And the military here in the U.S. was not interested, but the French and European countries showed a little more interest, so they went over there.
Yeah, well, it quickly went from being bicycle store owners in Dayton to being the center of international intrigue, and that's part of the story of the Wrights that people don't understand. That they're just these guys from Dayton that suddenly were the focus of all the great armies and navies of the world because they had this whole new thing going on. It makes for a great story, so I highly recommend the David McCulloch
It's an
book.
excellent book, and there's a lot of good books out there about the Wright brothers. Tom Crouch of the National Air and Space Museum has a good book out as well.
Yeah.
What I find really interesting is that Orville Wright lived to see Chuck Yeager break the sound barrier. You think
Yes.
about that.
Yeah, and the McCulloch book,
Short of time.
yeah,
Short of time.
the McCulloch book ends when Wilbur Wright dies. It's just about the brothers, and I guess that's why he decided. But I'd love to just get more about Orville and what his life was like as he went on over the years to see what he and his brother had created, evolved into.
Yeah, Wilbur died of spinal meningitis, if I'm not mistaken.
It was like 1947 or 48, I think.
Well, no, Orville died in 47
Oh,
of pneumonia. His brother died, I'm going to say the 20s.
No, it was 1912. It was that
Oh,
early.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. 1912.
Yeah.
You're right. Yes.
It
Yeah.
was Orville that died more recently.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I said something incorrect here. When I said that Louis Blériot flew the English Channel 16 years after the Wright brothers, I was
So
thinking
6.
1919. It's 6 years. It's 1909. This is
Well-
the problem with being live on
Well, what's a decade between
Yeah.
friends? You
No,
know?
1909. So it was
Yeah,
6 years
just
after
6
the
years.
Wright brothers that Louis Blériot flew across the English Channel.
Well, speaking of which, we are over the English Channel. We still have a ways to go before we're going to see the Cotentin Peninsula. I think just barely in the distance there. I think I often remember how I wondered when I was standing on a beach how far out I could see before I couldn't see anything. And it turns out when you're standing on a beach, it's about 7 miles if visibility is good before the curvature of the earth makes a boat disappear or something like that. But the higher you go, here's some more math, folks. The higher you go above the surface, the farther you can see. And so right now how high are we? Like 6,500 feet. So that expands our ability to see far away, and we can see the French coast, which is probably more than 20 miles away at this point, I think.
Jay, can they see the inset of the GPS there on that previous picture? Because you could see the coast very well on that.
When he calls it up, we can.
Right dead center there. You can see the coast.
Good.
And I was also noticing we've got a little bit of a tailwind right now. If I bring the GPS up again, our airspeed is about 132 knots, and ground speed, which is in the lower left corner of the map there, GS,
Mhm.
is 148 knots.
But
So
you,
a little bit of a tailwind.
I don't know if
can see
people could hear
black
that.
insert there at the top of the GPS screen. That's the Cotentin Peninsula.
Yes.
Yeah, we're heading south. Up is south.
That's Cherbourg.
Yes, that's right. And I was neglectful in getting the microphone over to Jay when he was talking, but he was saying that we have a slight tailwind. We are traveling at 130 or so, but there's a tailwind giving us a ground speed of 148. Am I seeing? Wow, that's
18 knots.
that's a
tailwind.
that's a good tailwind for a nice, beautiful day like this. I want to take a moment though to just take away the beautiful day we have, and take away the sunlight. Let's just imagine it's not a sunny, nice day. Let's imagine it's June 5th, 1944. And during that day, that was supposed to be the launch day for D-Day. That was supposed to be D-Day. And even before that, there were other days that would have been the launch date for it, but plans had been changing and evolving. I think the command decided they wanted even more material, essentially, and so it delayed the deployment of this until early June. And in a larger sense, this was something that had been promised for years. Hitler had taken over most of continental Europe except the neutral countries, Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain, and had been fortifying positions all across Europe for 2, 3, 4 years at this point. Meanwhile, he was fighting with Stalin's Soviet Union, and Stalin was dealing with it, but he had asked Roosevelt and Churchill and the Allies to open up a Western front at some point, rather than have all of Germany focused on fighting the Soviet Union. And at these conferences that you can read about in the history books, the Americans and the British did promise him that we will do that. They first fought in North Africa and worked their way up Italy in the mid part of the war in 1943. And that had been successful up to a point, but it still wasn't that Western front that had been promised to Stalin. That had to come through some kind of action from England, which had remained unoccupied by the Germans. And over the years, England and the Germans along the Atlantic coast of France had been fortifying positions all along. So it became kind of a waiting game. And Stalin was not going to wait forever. The Allies finally made a commitment in the mid part of the war that they would go forward with creating a Western front. But after that, everything had to be done in secret, because if the Germans knew all the details of what would be most certainly a massive invasion, it would be less successful if the Germans were able to understand what was coming and prepare for it. And so all through the year leading up to June 5th and 6th, 1944, there was this sort of chess game going on, trying to fool the Germans, to fake them out, while we built up tremendous amounts of personnel and material and transports and seacraft to create what would be the largest invasion in history of warfare, all in one night. It's now known as D-Day. And what you can see now is a picture of an original sort of planning chart that would have been used by the commanders in D-Day. It's in a museum in Britain somewhere. I can't recall. What you're seeing is we've flown over the Isle of Wight, which is up in the upper left-hand corner there. You see a lot of action coming out of Portsmouth, the harbor that we flew out of, and some other things coming toward what is a circle, and that was called Piccadilly Circus. It's a code name, I guess, for that, where a lot of the surface, seagoing transports would be gathered together for that trip across the channel during that night of June 5th to 6th. And that was only a small part of it, actually. It was a major proposition, but there were air support, and there were other things that the other map that we had kind of shows the routes where things were being brought in from all over the southern part of England to try and create essentially a toehold on continental Europe after 3 to 4 years of occupation by the German forces. One thing they had in their favor, which I think is worth noting, is that 4 or 5 years into World War II, the Germans had paid somewhat of a heavy price on their own from the Eastern Front and otherwise. And so a lot of the people manning the Atlantic Wall were conscripts from other nations that were being forced to serve, And so they were not as motivated, I think, as the Allies were. So that was something that they had in their favor. What we're looking at now is the Cotentin Peninsula, which is that part of France that sticks out and was sort of the aim of these troops that were coming over by air and by sea that night of June 5th and June 6th. Now, we're going to be looking to the left, which is where the beaches are, that were the beaches that were the site of the first landings in Normandy on D-Day. At the time, there's 5 beaches that were targeted. Originally there were 3, but in the expanded version that finally became the final plan, there were 5 beaches, and they were code-named. And I remember as a kid thinking, I read about this as a kid, and there'd be a Utah beach in France. And I thought, isn't that odd that France has a beach named after, like, Utah, in the American West? I didn't realize these were just military code names. So Utah was the furthest to the east, and where the Americans first landed. Omaha Beach was after that, and we'll see both of them. Utah Beach, the first one, was relatively flat and did not have the kind of cliffs that you see at Omaha, which were an obstacle for the landing troops. And then beyond that, there was Gold and Sword and Juno beaches. And the British and the Canadians landed on those beaches. But it was very much a team effort. The Allies, it wasn't just the British and the Canadian and the Americans, of course. It was people from the Dutch army, from all around the world, really, who were working with us to open the long-promised Western Front of World War II. Now, at the time, Hitler occupied all of Europe, and Britain was really the only part that was unoccupied, and it was an open question as to whether the Nazis would ever come across and occupy Britain. It seemed less likely the more time went by and the more the Allies reinforced Britain, but it could have gone any way. And what happened on D-Day was the first action to turn the tide of this situation in Western Europe that had prevailed for almost 5 years in some cases, where the German military had occupied the whole continent. We're just about to cross over into France and to make our first landfall in continental Europe. So, bonjour, everybody.
You think about Louis Blériot flying the Atlantic for the first time in an airplane, how that changed the dynamic for England and Great Britain in terms of access by other countries and military action and that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, for the first time, London and all of England was within range of attack by airplanes, and that wasn't the case for generations, centuries, all along. The English Channel protected Britain. It was almost like a moat, as we said earlier, but now aviation changed all of that. One of the other things the Allies had in their favor was that the German air forces had been really depleted in Western Europe, and the Allies had built up superiority to a factor of, I think, 10 to 1. They had the Germans had 1 aircraft essentially compared to 10 that we had going into this. And the German command realized that was going to be a problem as an anticipated invasion would take
Yeah, a lot
place.
of their pilots were fairly new as well.
Right.
Didn't have the experience.
So it's a bright sunny day, but we need to remember that at the time that D-Day happened, it was pre-dawn. Young men, young women were following orders to do something no one had ever done before. And there was no real sense of whether it would succeed. I think the planning had been done. Dwight D. Eisenhower and Monty and the British side and the other commanders had done everything they could to create an effective offense and provide that much needed toehold in Europe from which movement to the east could begin and retake Europe.
I'm sorry, think too about the relief to the English people of having been relieved of the attacks by the rockets against London, the V1s and the B2s.
Well, yeah, at that point, those would continue. And in fact, there was a heightened worry that once the Allies got onto European soil, Hitler would ramp up among other things, the atomic energy things that he was doing and create the very first nuclear-type weapons. And there was a very big fear that Germany would sort of get there first. And this is a whole other issue that I think people have a lot more expertise than I ever would. But it was a relief, but it was also a sense of foreboding, because maybe now Germany would get very serious about ramping up some devastating new weapons that no one knew about. And remember, we know all about atomic energy and what
But
that
the old
bomb would be.
weapons were terrifying enough.
They were, yes.
Especially to the London residents.
Right. So it was a time of great emotion on both sides, and we are now, I think, directly over, heading toward Utah Beach. It's going to be on your screen near our logo down there. It looks very peaceful today, as it does if you visit today. We've had a number of comments from people on the feed here about people who visited it, and I know there's a museum on the Utah Beach, and there are other memorials all around this coastal area. In 1944, when the sun came up, this would have looked very different. This would have been a landscape that had already been devastated by Allied bombing to essentially soften up the area. Behind Utah Beach, there's a series of channels. I think we're not quite there yet. It's further down, but it's very low and marshy land, and the Germans would have flooded that land if they had known there was an attack coming, to prevent any invaders from being able to make it any further inland. But on the night of the 5th of June into June 6th, the Allies had already sent quite substantial numbers of troops overhead to land behind enemy lines, essentially, and take key strategic crossroads in other locations behind the German fortifications and secure them to increase the chances of the beachheads being able to be pushed forward and through and establish them permanently. And that would allow them to essentially become temporary harbors that could allow the landing of a lot more substantial material, including tanks and everything you needed to start pushing inland. The city of Cherbourg, which we passed over, a major port. In fact, the Titanic called there on its way across on its maiden voyage. It left Southampton and went over to Cherbourg. It was a common port for transatlantic travel. So it's famous for that. But it was also very significant militarily at the time, and that was one of the objectives of the original D-Day invasion, was to try to cut off this peninsula and then save Cherbourg and turn it into a loading area for the Allies. But the Germans pretty much destroyed everything, knowing that they were going to lose it, and Cherbourg was not a functional port until well into the later part of the year. But that's war. So this whole countryside would have been devastated by Allied bombing to begin with. And not to say the Germans may not have damaged a lot of things too in their retreat. But this is the beaches of Utah now. I'm not a historian by training, but having read about this, I was very interested to learn that the landing in Utah, which was the earliest landings, I think, of all the D-Day landings, went wrong from the beginning because the weather and the currents caused everybody who was coming in to land about a mile to the east, further down the beach toward where there's an inlet that you see coming up, and it was closer to that. They didn't want to be. They wanted to be kind of right in the middle of where we are now. And it turned out to be very fortunate in that this was not anywhere where they wanted to land, and the Germans wouldn't have thought they would have landed there either. And so there was, it was not that any of this was easy, but it was relatively easy to get ashore. And I think of all of the beaches, this was the one that had the fewest casualties in the initial landings. It was only a couple of hundred losses in this massive maneuver that night and that morning. And the local commander, who was Theodore Roosevelt, descendant of the president, made a kind of famous remark, "We'll start the war from here then," when they found out they were all wrong in the wrong place. And they did, and they pushed inland, and it went on from there. So this is the beaches, the beach of Utah, the westernmost beach of the D-Day landings. And if you go there today, you'll find memorials, you'll find cemeteries that have many of those that lost their lives in the Normandy campaign, not just on D-Day, but throughout the first phase of trying to get onto the European continent and push the Nazi machine back out of France and finally push all the way to Berlin, which happened later on in 1945. So we're crossing over now. The next beach will be Omaha Beach. Omaha was more difficult because it had high bluffs. And even though this was not the location that the Germans anticipated the invasion to take place, they thought it would be at a more narrow part of the channel up around Dover and Calais, where we were earlier in this flight. They had still fortified the coast all along the Atlantic and the English Channel. And in this area, you find gun emplacements, and they had mined all the waters. They had put obstacles all across the beaches, barbed wire, low-tech stuff like that. But also, they had also, I don't know if any of our pilots can speak of this, but I was reading how one technique the Germans used to prepare was to create obstacles on fields that could have been used for landing. They would create, it was called asparagus, and it was a technique of creating these vertical obstacles that would preclude a landing from taking place by being positioned at key open fields.
That was prevent the gliders. So the DC-3s towing the gliders over prevent them from landing in the fields. And the gliders were just made out of fabric and wood. They were pretty fragile, and they were one-use gliders.
Mm-hmm. Right, they were not designed to be.
They were not designed to be used again, and they always got damaged on landing. I'm not sure, but they might not have even had landing gear. I think they had skids they would land on. Is that right?
I think that's right.
Right.
Yeah, they had skids, and so I can't imagine the personnel, the military people, riding in this glider down into the fields. It must have been quite something.
Well, there are a lot of injuries in that too,
Yeah.
and deaths. Yeah.
And it was the landing pattern didn't work out the way that it was intended either, and so many of the people that came down by chute or in the gliders were nowhere near where they wanted to be, and it was quite an effort to hook up with your other colleagues and have the Germans to fight all that time. But yet they were able to establish positions behind enemy lines successfully enough so that it all worked out to be a successful invasion, even though I think none of the original objectives for that first day were met. It was enough to get onto the continent and start moving inland in what turned out to be a successful operation. And when you say success, that sort of minimizes the price that was paid by thousands upon thousands of troops that came ashore at all these beaches and elsewhere and never made it to June 7th. For them, D-Day was the final day, and that's what Memorial Day should be about. And we've had some comments while we've been flying over from people. This is the best way to honor the men and women on Memorial Day that I have ever spent. I'm privileged to fly along. It's our privilege to have anyone who's joined us today for this as a way to think about the history that took place in this landscape that we're looking at.
It really is emotional for me anyway to be flying over this area where so many of our dedicated military people lost their lives and the sacrifices they made for the rest of us.
From the comments, Pamela Bothwell, I and my friend Bev brought our grandsons on a vacation to see the Normandy beaches. They were both amazed to read the crosses and how many young men came from Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. And of course, that's our home base here. But this is something for everybody. With the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire, but today this is for everyone. Everyone who served, everyone who served and was not able to return.
Jay, are we near Omaha Beach? Or are we?
I believe we're approaching it, yes.
Okay, it's kind of at the base of that curve. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, you can see where the
Yes.
cliffs are
Traces
there.
of the
What's our altitude?
We are at 1,400.
Okay.
So the beaches, all 5 of them, stretch out about 50 kilometers, I think about 30 miles. So it was not like one little beach. It was all across a wide range of the French coast that was judged to be the best place for us to get that toehold to create a western front that had been promised.
And the number of people was about 200,000 or so?
Yes, it was.
Counting all nationalities?
Yes, it was an international effort. That's true. And it was an example of overwhelming force. And there's another term that gets used, and a lot gets forgotten when you use that term, because let's break that down. When you have overwhelming force, that implies you have the ability to take losses. And so when you have landing craft coming to Omaha Beach, the first wave are going to take very heavy casualties. And the only reason the second wave can come behind them is because the first wave have already been there and suffered those losses. And then there's a third wave. And there's a fourth. And there's casualties every time another wave comes in. Just as the waves, as you can see on our landscape this afternoon, continue to wash upon the beaches at Omaha. So Memorial Day, of course, came from the Civil War to honor the people that didn't come back from that conflict, and it was known as Decoration Day back then. It stayed with us through World War I, called the Great War at that time, because who'd have thought there'd be another war to rival that one?
Another 2 wars.
And
Just
this
look
one-
at those cliffs along
Yes.
there.
And here we are looking at something that was part of what we now call World War II. And I think one of the main reasons we talk about it the way we do is because of this effort on June 6th, 1944, the sacrifices that were made by the people who made it a success are what we need to remember and never forget. History could have been so different had this not worked out or turned out the way that the planners had hoped it would. Now there's a landmark that we were hoping to see beyond Omaha Beach that I think will be difficult to see, but it's a German gun emplacement that was captured right away and was preserved. It's still there, and you can visit it. And it looks, I don't want to say it was built yesterday, but in the pictures I've seen, it's very well preserved. And you can see that the cliffs are covered by vegetation now, but the Germans had stripped all of that so as to take away the cover for the troops that were landing there. And the Germans would have had fortifications all along the top of that ridge. If you were landing, you would have had to make your way through the water onto the land, onto the beach, where there would be mines, there would be booby traps, there would be people firing at you from places you couldn't see.
Oh, you can really see the cliffs there.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I think that is the battery, that sort of raised.
Yes, and there's a sort of a memorial cemetery next to it.
And both Utah and Omaha beaches were beaches that Americans came up on.
Yes.
It could be that area right there.
Yes. I think that's one right there.
So we're going to be turning inland, I think, soon, right? Just because our flight path needs to turn inland to reach the airport before we run out of gas. Our DC-3 it's not an unlimited range. But
So just so we use the right language, aircraft use fuel. Cars use gas.
I'm the one non-pilot today, can you tell?
So just, you know,
Yes.
and after Omaha is Gold Beach, and the British came up on Gold Beach. Juno Beach, the Canadians came up on Juno Beach, and then Sword Beach, the British came up on Sword Beach.
And everyone made sacrifices, and even though Memorial Day is an American holiday, and it really is, it's only observed here in the United States. I should say there, because we're actually in France now, aren't we?
It's
for everyone.
Yeah, it's a multinational
It's for everybody who served
history.
for a greater cause.
Just checking our fuel.
Checking our fuel, okay. I'd like to just take out of respect for all the people that we've been speaking of, a moment of silence as we look at the beautiful French countryside that is there for us to look at because of them. If you've been with us for this flight from London, we're at the point where the pilot might say, we're going to be making our landing, not right away, but soon, in the town of Caen, France. It's not Caen like this film festival takes place, and that's on the southern coast, but this is a town in Normandy that itself was almost wiped off the map in all the fighting that ensued after the invasion. And it's been rebuilt substantially, and you can go there now and have a nice time. But I think in 1944 it was a very different proposition. This whole area was a battlefield that was the Western Front for a time until it moved. It wasn't long. I mean, it was a long summer, but eventually the Allies were able to liberate Paris and move into the eastern part of France. There was, of course, the Great Battle of the Bulge, the last German offensive in the mountains of Belgium and that area, in the Ardennes. But the ultimate goal of this was to get to Berlin, and they did that on what's now called VE Day in May. We just passed that a few weeks ago, and it was the 75th anniversary of the surrender of the German military and the end of the war in Europe. The war would still continue in the Pacific for some time, and that's something we'll be talking about later on in our flight as we make our way around the globe. This is just one part of a much larger adventure that we're so pleased that you could join us for today. I hope you'll continue to follow our exploits and adventures as we leave France. In our next segment, we're going to visit France. We'll fly over Paris. We may even have a look at Euro Disney World, I think, on the way out. But then we'll be up over the Low Countries, some parts of Germany, and other parts of Europe, and then later Africa. I hope we can get over the Taj Mahal in India, and so many other places to explore and learn about as we make our way around the globe. I'd like to also thank our sponsors for the flight. We're an all-volunteer organization, of course, and so we thank our volunteers for all the help. We have a technology committee that's helped arrange the whole around-the-world flight and today's broadcast, and Jay Carter, our flight engineer, is a member of that, as is Aura Lassila, who's our web guru behind the scenes today. Also on the committee is Bob Huff, who's with us on the plane, and Wendell Berthelsen and Lee Howenstein have played important roles in making this all possible. They're great volunteers that we really appreciate all their help and service at our museum. And there are many other volunteers. There's just too many to name right now, but we thank them all. Without them, we wouldn't have our museum. We wouldn't have our museum without the support of you, the public. So it's not like we're a telethon, but call us now. Support us by going to that link online that you see. It's our website, and we have a donation page where we would love to, I guess, get some money for the fuel, not the gas, right? Help us, help us with money for the fuel of our around-the-world flight.
And the oil. These engines burn a lot of oil.
They burn a lot of oil and other consumables. This is a learning project. This is for teachers and students who are trying to make the most of remote learning. And that's why we said, in an age, in a school year where all the field trips have been canceled, let's take the ultimate field trip using our simulator. We can fly all around the world, and we are doing it, thanks to everybody's support. And the sponsors whose logos you saw a little bit earlier, I just want to make sure we tip our wings to them. There's Wirebelt, a company right here in Londonderry, New Hampshire, that's been a major supporter of our efforts. There's the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport, And let's just hold on while we come in for a very dramatic landing. Let's get on where those rubbers marks are. Let's go. Okay, I think we're down. Oh, nicely done. Look at that. How about an applause for the pilot? Thank you. That's great. So we'll be here for just a few moments, but we have touched down in Caen, France. I want to finish acknowledging the sponsors, which include the Jay Carter himself and the information technology consulting business, SoManyAircraft.com, Aura Lassal's website about scale modeling information. The New Hampshire Humanities, who've provided a major grant for us to carry this program out. Our friends at Manchester Boston Regional Airport, they're great neighbors and they're our landlords. And Signature Flight Support, also at the Manchester Boston Regional Airport, plus the Queen City Rotary, which generously donated to our program just recently. We thank you all for making this possible so that we can, everyone who's been part of this broadcast, think about Memorial Day in a way where ordinary parades and other ceremonies just aren't going to be taking place. We can still get together, even if it is virtually, and ponder the sacrifices that were made that are the reason we have this holiday today. So wherever you are, whatever the weather's like, and whoever you're with, all of us at the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire want to wish you the very, very best Memorial Day. And if you have people in your life who were lost in serving their nation, we want to say thank you, and we want to honor their service, and we hope you felt that this is a way for us to do so.